Disclaimer: this is a fictional dramatization created for artistic, emotional, and educational storytelling purposes. All characters and events are entirely fictional and created using AI tools. No impersonation, misrepresentation, or harm is intended. The content contains scenes of danger involving child characters. However, no real persons or minors were involved in its production. Grace's Love Stories produces scripted, AI-generated stories that promote entertain, inspire kindness, and emotional connection. We respect our viewers and strictly adhere to YouTube's policies.
The great hall of the citadel was a cavern of breathless silence. Stone pillars, dark with age and wood smoke, climbed toward a vaulted ceiling lost in shadow. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of beeswax, old iron, and the collective anxiety of 24 courtiers who stood frozen along the walls. They dared not move. They dared not whisper. They only watched their king. Alpha King Vaden Ruskar stood alone before the hearth, its fire long dead. He did not look at them. His focus was on the great oak doors at the far end of the hall, his posture a study in predatory stillness. The copper red of his hair was a slash of muted color in the gloom, pulled back from a face carved from hard lines and sharper secrets. His scent filled the space, cold mountain air, storm-heavy ozone, and the faint, dangerous tang of a wolf held on a very short leash. Every guard, every servant, every nobleman felt it. The king was hunting, even while standing perfectly still. The wolf beneath his skin paced the cage of his ribs, a restless, primal thing starved of something it could not name. Then came the sound, a soft, rhythmic scuff of leather on stone, coming from the corridor beyond the doors. It was not a courtly slide or a soldier's measured tread. It was the sound of someone who walked as if the ground itself belonged to them, unhurried and unafraid. Vaden's head did not turn, but the tension in his shoulders tightened. A wire pulled taut to its breaking point. His wolf went silent, not calm, listening. The doors swung inward without a creak, pushed open by a single guard who immediately stepped back, his face a mask of nervous duty. And she walked in. Raisa Lornell did not belong in a king's hall. The wind was still tangled in her long chestnut hair, carrying the scent of pine needles and damp earth. Her simple wool skirt was hemmed with mud, and a smudge of dirt marked her cheekbone like a tribal sigil. She moved with a liquid grace that spoke of navigating fallen logs and riverbanks, not polished floors. Her dark blue eyes, the color of a twilight sky after a storm, found the king instantly. They were not filled with fear. They were not filled with defiance. They were simply weary, as if she had walked 1,000 miles just to stand in this one spot. A collective, stifled breath rippled through the courtiers, an omega, and a dirty, disrespectful one at that. To appear before the Alpha King in such a state was an insult worthy of the lash, or worse. They waited for the explosion, for the snarl that would curdle the air. Raisa stopped 20 feet from him. She didn't bow. She didn't offer a single word of apology for the 3 days she had been gone. She just stood there, breathing him in. Pine, riverstone, and the wild, open distance. Her scent was a rebellion in this cold, orderly hall. Vaden finally turned his head, his movement slow, deliberate. His green eyes, sharp enough to pierce shields and lies, swept over her. From the twigs in her hair to the mud on her boots. He saw everything, the exhaustion that hollowed her cheeks, the new scratch along her forearm, thin and red. The way she held her ground, not in challenge, but in certainty. "You are late," he said. His voice was not a roar, it was worse. It was a low, resonant calm that promised violence far more terrible than any shout. The air grew colder, heavier. It was a struggle just to draw a breath. Raisa met his gaze. The river was high. A gasp whispered through the room, the audacity, to offer such a plain, simple excuse to a man who commanded rivers, a king who could crack stone with a word. This was it. This would be her end. An old lord near the wall, Baron Fen, curled his lip in a sneer, already imagining the sound of the whip. But Vaden didn't move. He was cataloging the scents clinging to her. Pine sap, yes, the metallic tang of wet granite from the riverbed, but underneath it all, something else. Something faint and cloying. The scent of old magic. and rot. His wolf, the restless beast that had been tearing at his insides for 3 days, finally settled. It lay down in his soul, a great watchful guardian, its head on its paws. Its unease had not been for his authority or for her insolence. It had been for her. The hours she was missing were not an insult. They were a threat he had felt like a phantom knife sliding between his ribs. "You went to the Whispering Fen," he stated. It was not a question. The rot, he knew its signature. Her eyes flickered, the only sign of surprise she'd shown. "The elders say its waters can see what is to come. The elders are fools who trade in wives' tales and poison," he replied, his voice still dangerously soft. He took a step toward her. Then another. The court held its breath. The king was closing the distance. With each step he took, the air between them grew thick, charged with something no one else could understand. It was not just anger, it was a current, a magnetic pull that had existed between them since she was a girl. A secret language spoken in silence, in shared glances across crowded rooms, in the scent of his power and her wildness. She did not flinch as he stopped directly in front of her, so close he could feel the faint warmth radiating from her skin. He was a head taller, a predator looking down at his prey, but her chin remained lifted. He reached out, his fingers brushing the smudge of dirt on her cheek. The touch was impossibly light, yet it sent a jolt through her that made her pulse stumble. His skin was cool, like stone. The entire hall seemed to fade away. There was only the sound of their breathing, the scent of his ozone and her pine, a clash of worlds in the small space between them. He leaned down, his lips near her ear, his voice a growl meant only for her. "What did the water show you, Raisa?" She trembled, a faint, almost imperceptible tremor. She could feel the eyes of the court on her back, burning with hatred and confusion. They saw a king toying with a disobedient servant. They had no idea what they were witnessing. They didn't know the truth of her bloodline. They didn't know about the sacrifice. She was born to be a sacrifice, an omega with a cursed lineage, meant to be given to the old gods at the turn of the century to appease their hunger and ensure the kingdom's prosperity. It was an ancient, brutal tradition his father had upheld, a tradition Vaden had shattered the day he took the throne. He had forbidden the ritual. He had hidden her away in the citadel, giving her menial tasks, keeping her close but publicly distant, a ghost in his own court. He had refused to let her die, but the curse did not forget. It simmered in her blood, a cold poison that sometimes whispered of her fate. That was why she had gone to the fen, to seek an answer, to see if there was any escape. She turned her head slightly, her lips almost brushing his earlobe. Her voice was a wisp of sound, fragile and fierce. "It showed me a crown of bone," she whispered, "and a king's pyre." Vaden pulled back slowly, his green eyes were dark, unreadable pools of shadow. The prophecy was the same one the seers had given him. A death sentence. His death sentence. The court saw only the king's cold fury. They saw him stare down at the Omega, his expression hardening into granite. They saw his hand drop from her face. They expected the order for her execution. Instead, he turned to the room, his voice ringing with absolute command, cracking the silence like a whip. "Leave us!" There was a moment of stunned hesitation. Baron Fenn's jaw hung open, then a frantic scramble of motion. Bows were given, feet shuffled, and the great hall emptied in a rush of silk and steel, until only the two of them remained, bathed in the gray light filtering through the high windows. The heavy doors boomed shut, sealing them in. The silence that fell now was different. It was not the silence of fear. It was the silence of truth. Raisa watched him, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. He was not looking at her, but at the dead hearth, his profile sharp and unforgiving. "The scent of the fen is on you," he said, his voice flat. "It clings to you. They will smell it. They will start to ask questions." "Let them," she said, her voice finding its strength again. He finally looked at her, and for the first time, the mask of the king slipped. She saw the wolf in his eyes, not the alpha king, but the feral, protective creature that lived beneath his skin, the one that recognized her as its own. "They will call you a witch, a heretic. They will demand your purification. They will demand the old ways." "I am not afraid of them," she said softly. "You should be," he growled. the sound vibrating in the air between them. He took a step, backing her toward one of the massive stone pillars. You walk through my court like a ghost, smelling of prophecies and forbidden places. You defy me in front of my own council. What am I to do with you, Raisa? Her back hit the cold stone. He braced a hand against it, trapping her. His body was a wall of heat and power, his scent overwhelming her senses. Ozone, iron, and a deep, possessive musk that was his alone. She stared up into his eyes, her breath catching in her throat. This was the real Vaden. Not the cold king, but the tormented man, the alpha who fought his own destiny as fiercely as he fought hers. You could have let me go, she breathed, the words a raw confession. You could have let the ritual proceed. It would have saved you. His expression darkened into something fierce and painful. Their ritual would have been your death. And my damnation. He leaned closer still, his forehead nearly touching hers. His voice dropped to a raw, ragged whisper that tore at something deep inside her. I would burn this world to ash before I let them have you. The mark on her shoulder, the one she'd been born with, the faint swirling brand of the sacrificial omega, began to burn, a dull, aching heat that always woke in his presence. It knew its master was near, even if he refused to be. The heat of his words lingered in the air long after he pulled away. Vaden stepped back, and the space between them turned from a crucible into a cold, empty void. The Alpha King returned, his face a mask of iron control, his green eyes shuddered. The wolf was gone, caged once more behind the bars of duty. The intimacy of his confession vanished as if it had never been spoken. Raisa's back was still pressed against the stone pillar. It felt impossibly cold now, leaching the warmth he had left behind. Her pulse, which had thundered in her ears, slowly quieted to a nervous, unsteady beat. She watched him, waiting for the king to undo the damage the man had done. You will not return to the servants' wing, he said, his voice clipped and formal. The sound echoed slightly in the cavernous hall. And you will not leave the citadel walls again, not without my direct permission. She didn't protest. She knew this was coming. A cage, gilded or otherwise. The Grand Scriptorium is in the North Tower, he continued, turning from her to stare into the dead hearth again. He couldn't look at her when he gave the order. Archivist Silas will be your ward. You will assist him. You will sleep there. You will eat there. You are not to speak to the courtiers. You are not to speak of the fen. Is that understood? It was a prison sentence delivered as a protective measure. He was hiding her in plain sight, burying her in a tomb of forgotten words and dusty scrolls where the whispers of the court could not so easily reach her. Yes, my king, she said. The title felt strange on her tongue, like a lie. She had never called him that when they were alone. He flinched. A bare, almost imperceptible tightening in his shoulders. He heard the lie, too. Go, he commanded, his voice rougher now. A dismissal. Raisa pushed herself off the pillar. Every muscle ached with a weariness that went bone deep. She gave him a slight, shallow nod. Not a bow, never a bow, and turned her back on him. Walking away felt like tearing something. With every step, the invisible thread that connected them stretched thinner, humming with a painful tension. She could feel his eyes on her back, a physical weight. He was watching her, tracking her, the way a wolf tracks the one thing in the world it cannot bear to lose sight of. But he did not call her back. The king had won. The great oak doors felt heavier as she pushed them open. The corridor outside was no longer empty. Baron Fen stood talking in low, urgent tones with another nobleman, Lord Alman, a man whose ambition was as sharp and thin as his face. They fell silent the moment she appeared, their conversation cut off mid-sentence. Their eyes raked over her. They saw the mud on her skirt, the wildness in her hair, but they also saw that she was unharmed, unscathed. Not a lash mark, not a bruise. She had faced the Alpha King's legendary wrath and walked away whole. It was wrong. It was unnatural. Raisa met Baron Fen's gaze. His eyes were small and dark, glittering with a spiteful intelligence. He smelled of sour wine and the cloying scent of false deference. He looked at her not as an omega, not as a servant, but as a puzzle he was determined to solve, a blight he needed to excise. He dipped his head in a mockery of respect, a sneer playing on his lips. She ignored them both, walking past with her head held high, her footsteps steady on the stone. She could feel their stares burning into her back, far more hostile than the king's had been. His gaze was a shield. Theirs were daggers. She followed the winding corridors toward the north tower, deeper into the citadel's ancient heart. The torchlight grew dimmer here, the tapestries more faded. The air turned cooler, carrying the scent of old stone and something else. The dry, papery breath of history. The entrance to the scriptorium was a single, unadorned ironwood door. It was unlocked. She pushed it open and stepped inside, and the world fell away. It was a space built for silence. A vast circular chamber rose into a domed ceiling, where a single grimy skylight let in a pillar of dusty afternoon sun. Shelves curved along the walls, climbing 50 feet into the shadows, crammed with thousands of scrolls, leather-bound tomes, and stacks of loose parchment. A wooden walkway ringed the upper level, accessible by a precarious-looking spiral staircase. The air itself felt heavy with the weight of unspoken words, of forgotten lives and crumbling knowledge. It smelled of dust, of decaying leather, of the slow, patient rot of time. An old man sat at a massive oak desk in the center of the room, his back to her. He was thin, his shoulders hunched over a scroll he was painstakingly mending with fine needle and thread. "Archivist Silas?" Heisa's voice was quiet, but it sounded like a shout in the stillness. He didn't turn around. "The king sent you." It was not a question. His voice was a dry rasp, like leaves skittering across pavement. "There is a cot in the west alcove. Your meals will be brought. The latrine is behind the tapestry of the first men. Do not touch the scrolls on the central lectern. They are fragile. Everything else is covered in dust. You may begin by making yourself useful." And that was it, her welcome, her instruction, her new life. She found the alcove, a small space carved out between two towering shelves. A simple cot with a thin wool blanket was all that occupied it. It was a cell, a safe, quiet, lonely cell. She sank onto the cot, the rough blanket scratching against her cheek. The overwhelming silence of the scriptorium pressed in on her. Here, there was no wind, no river, no scent of pine. There was only dust and the ghost of Vaden's command. She closed her eyes. The memory of his face, inches from hers, flooded her senses. The raw pain in his eyes. The desperate, possessive growl of his promise. "I would burn this world to ash before I let them have you." He thought he was protecting her, but locking her away felt like a different kind of death. He was starving the wild thing inside her, the part of her that needed the open sky. He was trying to tame her, to make her fit inside the stone walls of his world, just as he was trapped inside them. The thought sent a pang of sorrow through her, not for herself, but for him. The Alpha King, a prisoner of his own crown. The mark on her shoulder, which had been a dull, constant ache, suddenly pulsed with a sharp, stinging heat. It had nothing to do with Vaden. His presence was a distant echo now. This was something else. Her eyes snapped open. She sat up, her senses on high alert. The feeling was coming from the room itself, from the shelves, from the ancient, sleeping knowledge that surrounded her. It was a hum, a low thrum of energy so faint that anyone else would have missed it, but she could feel it. It was the same cold, quiet magic she had sensed at the Whispering Fen. Slowly, she got to her feet. The archivist was still engrossed in his work, oblivious. Drawn by an instinct she didn't understand, Raisa walked along the curving wall of shelves, running her fingers lightly over the cracked spines of the books. Dust puffed up around her hand. She let the feeling guide her, the strange pull that resonated with the cursed blood in her veins. It grew stronger as she moved deeper into the shadows, toward a section of shelves that looked even older, more neglected than the rest. Her fingers stopped. She was touching a scroll case. It was made of dark, hardened leather bound with silver clasps that had tarnished to black. Unlike the others, it bore no markings, no title, no date, no seal. It was anonymous, forgotten, but it was not sleeping. A cold energy radiated from it, seeping into her fingertips, a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. The mark on her shoulder burned, a sharp, insistent pain, a warning, or a welcome. Her breath hitched. The air around the scroll case seemed to shimmer, to distort, as if it were guarding something that did not want to be found. Her hand trembled, but she did not pull it away. She felt a terrifying, undeniable connection to this object. This was why he had sent her here. He hadn't known it, but fate had. With a surge of desperate curiosity, she curled her fingers around the cold leather. The magic within it wasn't just old, it was hungry. The touch was a shock of ice and static. A jolt of freezing energy shot up Race's arm, straight to the mark on her shoulder, which answered with a searing, violent heat. She gasped, snatching her hand back from the leather scroll case, as if it were a hot coal. The air around it crackled, settling back into stillness. From the center of the room, a dry cough. Risa froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. Archivist Silas shifted at his desk, his back still to her. He scraped his chair back slightly, the sound unnaturally loud in the profound silence. She flattened herself against the bookshelf, trying to make her breathing inaudible, her presence nothing more than a shadow among shadows. She half expected him to turn, his ancient eyes pinning her with an accusation. But he only grunted, leaned over his scroll again, and the moment passed. Her pulse was a wild, panicked bird beating against the cage of her throat. She stared at the scroll case. It looked inert again, just another piece of forgotten history. But she had felt its power. Cold, ancient, and aware. It was a sleeping predator, and she had just prodded it with a stick. For the rest of the day, she kept her distance. She dusted shelves at the opposite end of the scriptorium, her movements stiff and clumsy. She could feel the scroll case, though. It was a void in the room, a pocket of cold that pulled at her awareness. The mark on her shoulder throbbed with a dull, persistent ache, a constant reminder. Night fell. A single candle on the archivist's desk and another near her cot were the only lights, casting long, dancing shadows that turned the towering shelves into monstrous teeth. Silas retired to a small chamber behind the tapestry, his soft, shuffling footsteps fading away. The silence he left behind was different. It was absolute, expectant. Raisa waited until she was sure he was asleep. Then barefoot, she padded across the cold stone floor, back to the shadowed alcove. The scroll case was waiting. Her hand trembled as she reached for it again. This time, she braced herself for the shock. The cold was still there, but it was less violent, more inquisitive. It seeped into her skin, a slow, probing chill that felt unsettlingly familiar. The silver clasps were stiff, fused shut by time and tarnish. Her fingers, clumsy, with a mixture of fear and determination, fumbled with the mechanism. It refused to budge. Frustration welled in her. This secret was locked away, and she had no key. She pressed her thumb against the largest clasp, her mind screaming at it to open, and the mark on her shoulder burned, not with pain, but with a sudden, intense pulse of white-hot energy. A tiny, almost invisible wisp of blue light, the color of her eyes, flowed from her mark, down her arm and into her thumb. The silver clasp clicked open. She stared, her breath caught in her throat. She tried the second clasp. The same thing happened. A pulse of heat, a whisper of light, and the lock yielded. It was her blood, her curse. It was the key. With the clasps undone, she lifted the leather lid. There was no rush of air, no explosion of magic, only a scent. It rose from the dark interior like a ghost, the smell of frozen earth, of dried blood, and of a winter so deep it had no memory of the sun. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded black velvet, was not a scroll. It was a single large piece of vellum, so dark with age it was almost the color of slate. She lifted it carefully. It was brittle, terrifyingly fragile, the edges threatening to crumble into dust. There were no words. It was a drawing, an intricate map, inked in a pigment that seemed to absorb the candlelight. It depicted the night sky, but the constellations were all wrong, twisted into unfamiliar shapes. At the center of the celestial chaos were two figures. One was a man with the lean, powerful build of an alpha, but his head was the head of a wolf, crowned with what looked like shards of bone. His hand was outstretched. The other figure was a woman. She was smaller, her face turned away from the viewer, but on her bare shoulder was a swirling, intricate mark. Her mark. Their hands were clasped, and flowing between them, connecting them, was a single, shimmering line. It was drawn in a silver ink that still held a faint, ghostly light. Risa couldn't tell if it represented a bond of magic or a shared stream of blood. She sank to the floor, the vellum held in her trembling hands. Her mind reeled. This was not a prophecy of a sacrifice. There was no altar, no knife, no pyre. This was a depiction of a union, a connection. The king and the Omega, bound together under a broken sky. Everything she had been taught, everything she had feared, was a lie. The ritual? What if it wasn't meant to be an execution? What if it was something else entirely? Something that had been corrupted and twisted over the centuries into a bloodthirsty tradition. A floorboard creaked nearby. With a jolt of pure adrenaline, Reza shoved the vellum back into its case, snapped the lid shut, and slid it deep into the shadows beneath the lowest shelf. She scrambled back to her cot, just as the tapestry leading to Silas's room rustled. The old archivist emerged, holding a flickering candle. He didn't look toward her. He walked to the central lectern, his bare feet making no sound on the stone. He adjusted a cloth over one of the ancient books, his movements slow and deliberate. Then he spoke, his voice a dry whisper that slithered through the darkness. Some knowledge is a poison, girl. Once ingested, it changes the color of the world forever. He didn't turn, he didn't look at her. He simply blew out his candle and disappeared back into his room, leaving her alone in the suffocating darkness, her heart pounding with a new and terrible understanding. He knew. He had always known. The next 2 days were a blur of silent torment. Reza performed her duties in a daze, her mind consumed by the image on the vellum. She felt watched, not just by Silas's occasional unnerving glances, but by the very walls of the scriptorium. The secret she now held was a living thing, breathing in the shadows beside her. On the third night, the loneliness became unbearable. She missed the wind. She missed the feeling of damp earth under her feet. She missed the raw, dangerous presence of Vaden, a presence that made her feel more alive than this dusty silence ever could. She took out a piece of scrap parchment and a charcoal nub, and from memory she began to sketch the 2 figures from the vellum, the wolf-headed king, the marked woman, the shimmering bond between them. The great ironwood door of the scriptorium groaned open. Reza's head snapped up, her heart leaping into her throat. A figure stood silhouetted against the dim torchlight of the corridor. Tall, lean, unmistakable. It was Vaden. He wasn't wearing his regal finery. He wore simple dark leather breeches and a plain linen tunic, unlaced at the throat. His copper hair wasn't tied back. It fell loose around his shoulders, making him look younger, wilder. The king had been left at the door. The wolf had come to call. He closed the door behind him, and the lock clicked shut with a heavy, final sound. He didn't speak. His green eyes scanned the vast, dark room, finding her immediately. He moved toward her, his footsteps the soft, deliberate tread of a predator. The air in the scriptorium, thick with the scent of old paper and dust, was suddenly sliced through by his own potent scent. Ozone, winter, and a sharp underlying current of restless anxiety. He stopped a few feet from her cot. His gaze fell to the parchment in her lap. She made a move to cover it, but it was too late. He had already seen it. His face hardened. "What is that?" His voice was a low growl. "Nothing," she said, her voice tight. He closed the distance in a single fluid step, towering over her. He smelled the air around her, his nostrils flaring slightly. He wasn't just looking at the drawing. He was scenting her, scenting the faint, ghostly trace of cold magic that still clung to her from the vellum. "You found something," he stated, his eyes narrowing. "In this library of ghosts, you found a new one to speak with. Show it to me." "It's just a drawing." "Show me," he commanded, the Alpha King's power saturating his voice, making the very air vibrate. It was a command that brooked no argument, a power designed to bring Omegas to their knees, but it only made her lift her chin. No, a muscle jumped in his jaw. The wolf in his eyes flared, hot and dangerous. He reached down, not for the parchment, but for her. His hand closed around her upper arm, his grip like iron. He hauled her to her feet, pulling her flush against him. "Do not test me, Reza. Not tonight." She was trapped between the unyielding wall of his body and the towering bookshelf behind her. His heat, his scent, his raw power, it was overwhelming. The mark on her shoulder burned, screaming in protest and in a strange, terrible longing. His gaze dropped, drawn by the pulse of energy he could no doubt feel. It fell to her shoulder, to the plain fabric of her tunic that covered the mark. His expression shifted. The anger was still there, but it was now laced with something else, something that looked like pain. "Does it hurt?" he asked, his voice suddenly raw, stripped of its royal authority. She couldn't find her voice to answer. She just stared at him, her breath trapped in her lungs. He saw the answer in her eyes. Slowly, grimly, he released her arm. With his other hand, he reached up to the collar of his own tunic. He pulled the rough fabric aside, baring the skin above his heart. And she saw it. A scar, a jagged silver-white line that branched out like a bolt of lightning frozen on his skin. It was not a battle wound. It was old, unnatural, and it seemed to hum with the same cold energy as the scroll case. "Mine does," he whispered, his voice a broken thing. "It burns every time I feel your fear. It has for 16 years. He looked from his scar back to her, and in his eyes she saw the ghost of a memory. Fire, shouting, the terrified face of a 7-year-old girl, herself strapped to a stone altar. He reached out, his fingers trembling slightly. He didn't touch her skin. He gently, reverently traced the shape of her mark through the thin wool of her tunic. The moment his fingers made contact, the world shattered. It wasn't a memory. It was a vision crashing through them both at the same time. A flash of a snowy clearing, a sacrificial knife glowing with runes, his father's cold eyes, then his own voice, a boy's defiant shout. He had thrown himself in front of her, taking the blow meant to activate her mark, the blow meant to begin the ritual. The cursed blade had struck his chest, marking him, binding him. The scar on his chest was not just a wound, it was one half of a lock, and the mark on her shoulder was the other. The vision shattered, leaving them gasping in the dusty silence of the scriptorium. The air between them was electric, humming with the aftershock of a memory that was more than a memory. It was a scar on time, and they had both just touched it. Raisa stumbled back, her hand flying to her shoulder as if she could physically hold the screaming mark in check. Her mind was a whirlwind of images. The glint of the ritual knife, the scent of her own childhood terror, and Vaden, a boy no older than 16, all sharp angles and furious, desperate bravery, throwing himself between her and the blade. The blade had struck him, and its magic, meant for her, had forked like lightning. One branch had seared the scar onto his chest. The other had lashed out, striking her shoulder, activating the dormant curse in her blood, branding her forever. He hadn't just saved her from the sacrifice. He had become part of it. He had tethered his own life force to her curse. Vaden stood rigid, his hand still clenched over the scar on his chest. His face was pale beneath his coppery hair, his green eyes dark with the ghosts of that night. The wolf inside him was snarling, a low, guttural sound of rage and pain that she could feel in her own bones. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the past. "My father believed he was strengthening the ritual," he said, his voice a low, ragged rasp. "Binding the Alpha's blood to the Omega's curse, a shared sacrifice to appease the old gods and double their blessing on the pack." He finally met her eyes, and the agony in them was a physical blow. He was a fanatic. He didn't understand the text. He thought he was creating a bond of power. Instead, he created this, the unbearable connection between them. The pain that echoed across their skin. The instinct that drove his wolf to madness whenever she was in danger. It wasn't just a king's protectiveness over a subject. It was a chain, forged in blood and dark magic 16 years ago. "Why didn't you tell me?" she whispered, the words barely audible. All these years she had thought he pitied her, the cursed Omega he was honor-bound to protect. She never imagined the truth was so much more brutal, that he was bound to her, a prisoner of the same fate. "Tell you what," he growled, the Alpha King's mask slamming back into place, a shield of cold fury. "That my father branded you like livestock and scarred me in the process. That every breath you take is a risk to my kingdom because the old families still see your death as their salvation. That I can feel every time your cursed blood aches, as if the pain is my own. What good would telling you have done?" He advanced on her, backing her against the shelves again. The scent of his fury was a storm in the enclosed space. "I locked you in here to keep you from chasing prophecies in poisoned bogs," he snarled, his voice low and dangerous. "To keep you away from their whispers. And yet you find the one secret in this entire citadel that can unravel everything." He gestured wildly at the darkened shelf where the scroll case was hidden. "What did you see, Raisa? What did that vellum show you?" The fear was gone, replaced by a surge of anger that was as fierce and bright as his own. "It showed me the truth," she shot back, her voice ringing with newfound strength. That this isn't a sacrifice, it's a union, a bond, the drawing, it wasn't of an execution. It was a ritual of two halves becoming one. Your father didn't just corrupt it, he perverted it. The breath left his body in a harsh, audible rush. He stared at her, his fury momentarily forgotten, replaced by a stunned, stark disbelief. A union? Yes, she insisted, her heart pounding. She pushed past him, her fear of his anger eclipsed by the urgency of the truth. She knelt, her fingers finding the cold leather of the scroll case in the dark. She pulled it out and flipped open the clasps, her movements sure and certain now. She spread the ancient vellum on the floor in the single pool of candlelight. Vaden knelt beside her, his larger frame casting a shadow over the drawing. He looked down, and the last of his royal composure crumbled. She saw not the king, but the man, his face etched with a dawning horror and a terrible, fragile hope. He reached out a single finger, tracing the silver line that connected the wolf-headed king and the marked woman. His touch was hesitant, reverent. "All this time, I thought I was fighting your fate," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "But we have been fighting ours." They stayed like that for a long time, kneeling together in the candlelight, the silent testimony of their shared destiny, spread between them. The scriptorium was no longer a prison. It was a sanctuary, the only place in the world that held their truth. The atmosphere between them had shifted. The anger was gone, the tension replaced by a fragile, terrifying intimacy. She could feel the steady beat of his heart, smell the scent of his skin, without the sharp edge of command. He was just Vaden, and she was just Rasa, two halves of a curse, or a blessing. "The elders of the council," he said at last, his voice heavy. "Baron Fen, Lord Almon. Their families have always been the keepers of the old ways. They were the ones who pushed my father. They read the same texts. They must know the truth. They want you dead not to appease the gods, but to sever this bond. To weaken you," Rasa breathed, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. "If I die, the bond shatters. Half of your life force, half of your alpha strength, shatters with it." It was a coup, planned across a generation, a slow, patient assassination. He looked at her, his green eyes blazing with a cold, clear fire. The wolf was back, but it wasn't caged. It was looking through his eyes, lucid and lethal. They will not succeed. He stood up, pulling her to her feet with him. He still held her hand, his fingers laced through hers. His grip was firm, grounding. "The first snow of winter is in 3 days. The council will demand a meeting. They will use the changing of the seasons, the old town portents, to call for the ritual, to call for your blood." "What are we going to do?" she asked, her voice steady. The fear was gone. Knowing the truth, sharing it with him, had forged something hard and unbreakable in her soul. "We are going to give them a ritual," he said, a grim, dangerous smile touching his lips for the first time. It transformed his face, making him look both beautiful and terrifying. "But it will be ours, not theirs." He led her from the scriptorium, his hand never leaving hers. He didn't take her back to her alcove or to the servants' wing. He led her up the winding stairs of the north tower, higher and higher, until they reached the heavy oak door that led to his private chambers. He pushed the door open, leading her into a space that was the complete opposite of the scriptorium. It was Spartan, functional. A large bed covered in simple furs, a weapon rack against one wall, and a massive arched window that looked out over the sleeping city and the dark, sleeping forest beyond. The air smelled only of him. He walked to the window, pulling her with him. The moon was a sliver of silver in a black sky. "There is a place," he said, his voice low, intimate, a clearing deep in the white wood. "It is where the first Alpha and the first Omega were said to have pledged their fealty, not to the gods, but to each other. Under the moon and the snow, the text my father ignored called it the Gweden, the blood oath." He turned to face her. The moonlight caught in his eyes, making them glow. He lifted her hand, the one he was still holding, and pressed his lips to her knuckles. The touch was not one of a king to a subject. It was the touch of a man to his equal, his mate. The vellum showed a union, Rasa, a bond of two halves becoming one. The old magic doesn't demand your death. It demands your life. It demands you choose to bind it freely. He paused, his gaze searching hers, vulnerable for the first time. It demands that I choose as well, to accept the other half of my own soul. The mark on her shoulder pulsed with a warm, steady light, a feeling she had never experienced before. It wasn't pain. It was recognition. It was a homecoming. They want a sacrifice, he continued, his voice dropping to a fierce whisper. On the first snow, we will go to the clearing. We will give them one. We will sacrifice the lives we lived apart and begin the one we were meant to live together. We will forge the blood oath, and when the council comes for an Omega's blood, they will find a queen's power instead. He raised her hand to his chest, placing it directly over the scar that mirrored her mark. Beneath her palm, she could feel the powerful, steady beat of his heart, the heart of a king, the heart of her wolf. But you must choose it, Raisa. I will not be my father. I will not force this bond on you. You can walk away now. I will find another way to protect you. But if you stay, if you take this oath with me, there is no going back. You will be bound to me, as I am to you, for all our lives. She looked from the fierce hope in his eyes to the dark forest beyond the window, the forest that had always been her only solace. It was no longer a place to hide. It was a place to be reborn. She did not need to think. Her soul had made this choice 16 years ago, in a clearing of fire and blood. I will not walk away, she said, her voice clear and strong. I choose the oath. I choose you. A shudder went through his entire body, a release of tension he had probably carried for his entire life. He closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them, the last of the king was gone. There was only Vaden, the man who had been scarred for her, the alpha who had found his other half. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion, but of solemn promise. A sealing of a vow under the silver moon, a blood oath made without a single drop of blood. The snow is coming, and with it, a reckoning. The first snowflake fell just after dawn. It was a single, perfect crystal that spiraled down from a sky the color of old pewter, melting the instant it touched the dark glass of the window pane in Vaden's chamber. Then came another, and another. Within the hour, a soft, silent shroud began to settle over the citadel and the world beyond. Raisa stood at the window, watching it fall. The air was still, holding its breath. Every sound was muffled by the thickening blanket of white. It was beautiful, and it was terrifying. This was the day of the blood oath, the day their lives would be reforged or shattered completely. Vaden stood behind her. He hadn't slept. Neither had she. They had spent the night in a state of charged stillness, talking in low voices about the vellum, about the clearing, about the 16 years of pain that had led them to this single pivotal moment. He had been tender, his royal guard stripped away, leaving only the man, the alpha, who was bound to her. He had touched the mark on her shoulder through her tunic, his fingers tracing its pattern as if memorizing a map, and for the first time, it had answered with a gentle, soothing warmth. Now, with the snow falling, the king was returning. She could feel it in the way the silence stretched, in the tension that began to gather in his shoulders again. He came to stand beside her, his scent of ozone and winter mingling with the cold, clean air drifting from the window. They will have seen the snow, he said, his voice a low rumble. Baron Fen will be gathering the council. We should go now, Raisa urged, turning from the window to look at him. Before they can act, we can slip out through the old tunnels. A shadow passed over his face, a flicker of something she couldn't read. Patience, Raisa. To flee is to show guilt, to show fear. I must face them. I am still their king. I will meet them, hear their predictable arguments, and I will dismiss them. Then we will go, together as we planned. His words were meant to be reassuring, but a cold knot of dread formed in her stomach. Vaden, they don't want arguments, they want blood. And they will not have it, he said, his voice hardening with the unmistakable edge of command. He placed his hands on her shoulders, his grip firm, possessive. His green eyes bored into hers. You will wait for me here, in this room. Lock the door behind me. Let no one in. Trust me in this. I will not be long. It was the tone of a king giving an order, not a mate making a promise. The distinction was a sharp, painful sting. He was already building walls between them again, the very walls they had spent the night tearing down. But she saw the conflict in his eyes, the wolf fighting the crown. She had to trust him. She had chosen to trust him. She nodded, her throat too tight to speak. He leaned down and pressed a hard, quick kiss to her lips. It tasted of desperation and grim resolve. "I will come back for you," he whispered against her mouth. "I swear it." Then he was gone. The heavy door of his chamber closed behind him, and she heard the sound of his boots striding away down the corridor. Her hand shaking, she slid the heavy iron bolt into place. The sound echoed in the room, a final, definitive clang. The sound of a cage door swinging shut. She was alone. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the whisper-soft sound of the snow falling outside. Minutes stretched into an hour. The dread in her stomach coiled tighter and tighter. She paced the room, from the window to the hearth, her bare feet silent on the cold stone. She could feel him, a distant thrum of power through their bond. She felt his anger, his frustration, a great seething storm of it. He was with the council. He was fighting, but then the feeling began to change. The anger was still there, but it was contained, bankrolled. Beneath it, a new feeling rose, something cold and sharp and utterly devastating. Resignation. The mark on her shoulder, which had been warm and placid, began to prickle with a cold, sharp pain, a pain of severance, a pain of betrayal. No, she was imagining it. He had sworn, "I will come back for you." Then came the footsteps. Not one set, a dozen. The heavy, synchronized tread of armored guards, stopping directly outside the chamber door. Raisa froze in the center of the room, her blood turning to ice. Her gaze flew to the door, to the iron bolt she had slid into place. A heavy fist pounded on the wood. "Lady Raisa!" The voice was that of Commander Alman, Lord Alman's cruel, ambitious son, the captain of the King's Guard. "By order of the Alpha King, you will open this door." The Alpha King, not Vaden. Her heart plummeted. "He told me to let no one in," she called out, her voice trembling. "I will wait for him." There was a moment of silence. Then Alman's voice came again, laced with a smug, triumphant cruelty. "The king will not be returning for you. His Majesty has convened with the council. He has listened to the wisdom of the elders and the will of the people. He has acknowledged the gravity of the ancient laws. An agreement has been reached." Raisa could barely breathe. The air in her lungs felt like crushed glass. What agreement? For the good of the kingdom, to ensure the winter is not a harsh one, a sacrifice must be made. The king has made a difficult choice, a king's choice. The words from the vellum, from her own mouth, echoed in her mind. A king's choice. He was choosing the crown over their bond, over her. "He has promised to exile you," Alman announced, his voice ringing with satisfaction. "You will be taken to the Grey Coast, to the Barren Isles, where your curse can harm this kingdom no more. This is the king's decree. Now open this door, or we will take it down." The promise was broken. The oath was a lie. He wasn't coming back for her. He had traded her life for political stability. He had faced his test, the choice between his power and their bond, and he had failed. He had chosen to be his father's son. A hot, blinding rage surged through her, so powerful it eclipsed the pain. It was the fury of the wild thing he had tried to cage. He would not do this to her. She would not be a pawn in his game, a sacrifice to his crown. She had chosen the oath. She had chosen him. If he would not honor that choice, she would. She looked around the room, her mind racing. The window. It was her only way out. It was a sheer drop of at least 60 feet to the snow-covered courtyard below, but to one side, the ancient stone was covered in a thick, gnarled ivy, its winter branches like a skeletal ladder. It was a suicidal risk, but staying was a death of a different kind. The first splintering crash came as the guard slammed a battering ram into the door. Raisa didn't hesitate. She grabbed the heavy fur blanket from the bed, her only shield against the biting cold, and ran to the window. Her fingers, numb with cold and adrenaline, fumbled with the iron latch. It was rusted shut. Another crash against the door. The wood groaned, splitting. She put her shoulder into it, throwing all her weight against the window frame. It didn't budge. Tears of desperation and fury stung her eyes. She wouldn't let them take her. She wouldn't let him break her. She looked around and her eyes landed on a heavy silver candlestick on the mantel. She snatched it up. Crack! The door shuddered, a large fissure appearing down its center. They would be through in seconds. Risa swung the candlestick with all her might, smashing it against the leaded glass of the window pane. It shattered, a cascade of dark, glittering shards. Cold air and snowflakes rushed into the room. Without a second thought, she swung again, clearing the rest of the glass from the frame. She threw the fur over her shoulders and scrambled onto the ledge. The wind was a physical blow, tearing at her, trying to throw her from her precarious perch. Below, the courtyard looked a world away. Her heart was a frantic drum. For a single terrifying second, she faltered. Through the bond, she felt him, a surge of pure, undiluted agony. His agony. He was feeling her terror, her decision. He knew what she was doing. Don't, the feeling pleaded across the bond. A desperate, silent scream. The door behind her exploded inward. Risa didn't look back. She took a breath, found a handhold on the frozen ivy, and launched herself into the void. The fall was a chaos of tearing ivy, scraping stone, and the biting whip of the wind. Branches clawed at her, ripping at her tunic and the fur blanket, leaving stinging scratches across her skin. For a heart-stopping second, she was just air and gravity, a plummeting stone. Then her feet hit something solid, and she crashed down into a snowdrift that was deep enough to cushion the worst of the impact, but not the shock that jarred every bone in her body. Pain, white-hot and blinding, shot up her ankle. She gasped, the frigid air searing her lungs. For a moment, she lay stunned in her crater of snow, the world a dizzying swirl of white flakes against a gray sky. A horn blew from the battlements above. A single, sharp, piercing note. The alarm, adrenaline, cold and sharp, cut through the pain. She couldn't stay here. She forced herself up, putting weight on her injured ankle. It screamed in protest, but it held. She was covered in snow, her hair wild, the fur blanket tangled around her. She looked less like a person and more like some feral creature of the wood that had stumbled into the open. Across the courtyard, doors were being thrown open. Guards, alerted by the horn, were beginning to pour out, their dark armor a stark contrast to the pure white snow. Their shouts were muffled, swallowed by the heavy, silent air. Risa didn't think. She ran. She limped, favoring her bad ankle, a desperate, hobbling gait that felt impossibly slow. She fled across the open ground of the courtyard, heading for the shelter of the godswood that bordered the citadel's western wall. Every step left a deep, telltale track in the pristine snow. They would follow. They would find her. The first arrow hissed past her ear, thudding into the snow just ahead. She didn't look back. She pushed harder, her lungs burning, the pain in her ankle a constant throbbing fire. The trees were so close, the dark, silent promise of their shelter. She burst through the tree line, plunging into the sudden twilight of the ancient forest. Here the snow was thinner, clinging to the branches of the great pines and oaks, dusting the forest floor in patches. The silence was deeper, broken only by her own ragged breathing and the frantic pounding of her heart. She pushed on, deeper into the woods, her only guide an instinct that pulled her toward the north, toward the clearing of the Blood Oath. It was the only place that felt like sanctuary. The bond, that terrible, beautiful chain between her and Vaden, was a roaring torrent in her soul. She could feel his panic, his fury, his desperation. It was a maelstrom of emotion so powerful, it threatened to drown her. He was close. He was coming. But was he coming to save her, or to drag her back to her exile? She heard the sounds of the pursuit behind her. The crunch of boots on snow, the snapping of twigs. Commander Almond's voice, shouting orders. They were fanning out, hunting her like an animal. She ducked behind a massive fallen log, pressing herself into the snow, trying to still her ragged breaths. Her entire body trembled, from the cold, from the pain, from the sheer, overwhelming terror of the hunt. She was an Omega, a creature meant for hearth and home, not for this brutal flight for survival, but the wildness that Vaden had tried to cage, the spirit that had sent her to the Whispering Fen, surged within her. She was not just an Omega, she was Risa, and she would not be broken. A figure moved through the trees to her left, a guard silhouetted against the snow. She held her breath, flattening herself further. He passed by, his gaze sweeping the woods, missing her by inches. As his footsteps faded, another sound took their place. A single, deliberate crunch of a footstep, right behind her. Risa's blood ran cold. She had been so focused on the men in front of her, she hadn't heard him approach. It was too late to run. Slowly, she turned her head. Vaden stood there. He was cloaked in a heavy, dark fur that was dusted with snow, his copper hair a wild flame against the monochrome landscape. His face was a mask of granite, but his eyes were a tempest of raw, unguarded agony. He wasn't with the guards. He was alone. "Raisa," he breathed, her name a prayer and a curse on the winter air. She scrambled to her feet, her injured ankle forgotten in the sudden, violent resurgence of her rage. The pain of his betrayal was a blade twisting in her gut, sharper than any physical wound. "Stay away from me," she snarled, the sound raw, feral. She backed away from him, her hand grabbing a thick, heavy branch from the fallen log, brandishing it like a club. His face contorted in pain. The exile was a lie. All your promises are lies," she cried, her voice breaking. "You swore you would come back. You swore it was our oath, and you traded me. You traded me for your crown, for peace with those vipers in your court." "No," he roared, the sound echoing through the silent woods, the full power of the Alpha King in his voice. It was a sound that could stop armies, that could make mountains tremble, but it didn't make her flinch. "It was a diversion, a ploy. I knew Fen and the council would never let us leave together. I sent Alman with the order to appease them, to make them think they had won. I was already on my way to the clearing to prepare it. I was going to intercept your escort on the road. I was coming for you, I swear it." She stared at him, the branch held tight in her trembling hand. His words were desperate, frantic, but his eyes held the devastating weight of truth. He had been trying to outmaneuver them. A king's choice. A strategist's gambit that had horribly, catastrophically misfired. He had trusted his men. He had trusted the process. He hadn't trusted her. He hadn't trusted their bond enough to tell her the truth. "You left me alone," she whispered, the accusation a blade of its own. "You left me to believe I was abandoned, to be hunted. That is my shame," he said, his voice raw. "I underestimated their cruelty. And I underestimated you. I never imagined you would—" He gestured vaguely toward the citadel. "I never thought you would fly." Before he could say more, the woods around them came alive. Commander Alman stepped out from behind a large oak, a cruel smile on his face. He was not alone. Baron Fen was with him, and a dozen of the king's guard, their swords drawn, forming a loose, inescapable circle around them. "How touching," Baron Fen said, his voice a dry rustle of old leaves. "A reunion." He looked from Vaden's tormented face to Raisa's defiant one, his small eyes glittering with triumph. "Did you really think it would be so easy, Your Majesty, that we would let such a potent weapon slip through our fingers?" Vaden's entire posture changed. The desperate man vanished, replaced by the lethal predator. He moved to stand in front of Raisa, shielding her with his body. "Treason, Fen? You would dare?" "It is not treason to cleanse the pack of a curse," Fen sneered, "or to remove an alpha so weakened by it that he would lie to his own council. We know about the bond, Vaden. We have always known. We know what the ritual truly is. Your father was a fool to halt it. He should have killed the girl when she was a child, but his mistake is our opportunity." He gestured to Alman. "Kill the Omega, sever the bond, then the king will be ours to deal with." Alman and two other guards advanced, their swords glinting in the gray light. Vaden didn't wait. He moved with a speed that was not entirely human. A low, guttural snarl ripped from his throat as his hands became claws, his teeth elongating into fangs. The wolf was loose, a storm of fury and protective instinct. He met the first two guards in a blur of motion, the sound of their bodies hitting the snow-covered ground a wet, final thud. But there were too many. While Vaden was engaged, Alman lunged for Raisa. She swung the branch with all her might, catching him across the side of the head. The blow was clumsy but solid, making him stagger back, his face contorted in surprised rage. It bought her only a second. This was it. This was the end Fen had planned, to die here in the snow, to take Vaden down with her. "No. Vaden!" she screamed, her voice cutting through the sounds of the fight. "The oath! Now!" He threw a guard from him, his head snapping toward her. Understanding dawned in his wild green eyes. It was a desperate, impossible chance. A ritual of union in the midst of a battle for their lives. "Raisa, your hand!" he roared. She stumbled toward him as he fought his way back to her. A guard slashed at her, and she dodged, the blade slicing through the fur blanket. They met in the center of the clearing, their backs pressed together, surrounded. He reached back, his hands searching for hers. His fingers were slick with blood. The moment their skin touched, a jolt of pure energy, hot and blinding, shot through them both. "I choose this bond," he growled, his voice a vow made to the chaos. "I choose you, my other half, my life for yours." The mark on her shoulder and the scar on his chest erupted in a silent explosion of light. "I choose to stay," she answered, her voice ringing with power. "I choose you, my alpha, my soul for yours." A visible, shimmering arc of silver light erupted from their clasped hands. It wrapped around them, a shield of pure energy, throwing the circle of guards back as if they had been struck by lightning. The light pulsed, a great silent heartbeat that illuminated the entire clearing, making the snowflakes glitter like diamonds. Baron Fen stared, his face a mask of disbelief and horror as the ancient magic, the true magic, uncoiled before him. The silver light poured into Vaden. He roared, a sound that was no longer half man, half wolf, but something more. Something primal and absolute. The power of the completed bond surged through him, healing him, strengthening him, making him whole. The light poured into Risa, not with force, but with a deep, resonant warmth. The pain in her ankle vanished. The cold receded. The fear was replaced by an unshakable certainty. She was no longer a curse. She was a conduit. She was his anchor. She was his queen. When the light faded, they were still standing, their hands clasped. The surviving guards were groaning on the ground. Baron Fen was scrambling to his feet, his face pale with terror, turning to flee. He didn't get far. A dark shape, faster than the eye could follow, shot past Risa. Vaden, his eyes glowing with the full, untamed power of the unified Alpha, brought the Baron's treason to a swift and brutal end. The clearing fell silent. The fight was over. Snow was still falling, soft and gentle, beginning to cover the blood and the bodies, burying the old lies. Vaden came back to her. The claws and fangs had receded, but the power in his eyes remained. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and she saw no king, no guilt, no curse. She saw only her mate. He lifted their clasped hands and pressed his lips to hers. It was not a kiss of promise or of apology. It was a kiss of arrival. A kiss that said, "We are home." The snow kept falling, and under its quiet grace, their real lives had just begun. The scent of the world had changed. 3 months had passed since the battle in the snow-drowned woods, and the air that drifted through the open window of the king's chamber no longer carried the sharp, sterile bite of winter. It was softer now, smelling of damp, dark earth, of the sweet decay of fallen leaves, and the first courageous buds on the ancient rowan trees. It was the scent of a world beginning again. Risa stood before the hearth, the low, steady fire casting a warm, golden light on her skin. She wore a simple gown of deep blue wool, but it was the gown of a queen, not a servant. She was tracing the scar on Vaden's chest with the tip of one finger. The jagged, silver-white line was no longer a mark of pain. It was cool and smooth beneath her touch, a part of the landscape of his skin. A map of the road that had led him to her. He was sitting in a heavy oak chair, his back to the fire, watching her. The constant, restless tension that had always held him rigid was gone. The wolf beneath his skin was not pacing. It was sleeping peacefully, its head on its paws, utterly content. The crown sat on a nearby table, not on his head. He was not the Alpha King in this room. He was just Vaden, her Vaden. "It doesn't burn anymore," he said, his voice a low, quiet rumble that vibrated through her fingertips. It wasn't a question. He knew. Through the bond, he felt everything she felt, just as she felt the steady, powerful calm that had settled in his soul. "No," she whispered, her finger tracing the lowest branch of the scar. "It's quiet. The mark on my shoulder is quiet too." She looked up, meeting his green eyes. "It feels like it's finally home." A slow, gentle smile touched his lips, a true smile that reached his eyes and softened the hard lines of his face. He caught her hand, lacing his fingers through hers, and tugged her gently onto his lap, She settled against him, her head finding its perfect place in the crook of his neck, and she breathed him in. Ozone and winter, yes, but now, underneath it all, the warm, grounding scent of the hearth, of safety. The council met this morning, he murmured into her hair. The new one. Lord Eris sends his fealty from the sunken valleys. He says the other packs have never been so quick to answer a royal summons. They can feel the change. They feel the strength of the bond. She knew what he meant. The kingdom was healing. The whispers and the plotting had died with Baron Fen in the snow. The old families, faced with the undeniable truth of the blood oath's power, had either bent the knee in genuine awe or fled into obscurity. The court was smaller now, but it was loyal. It was whole. Archivist Silas asked after you, Vaden continued, his thumb stroking the back of her hand. He said the scriptorium is too quiet without you rustling through its darkest corners. Raisa smiled against his shoulder. Did you know that he was guarding the vellum? She felt his nod. My mother put him there. She was a scholar of the old ways. She knew what my father was becoming, the path of fanaticism he was on. She charged Silas with protecting the truth of the bond, to wait for the day when someone with the blood of the curse was strong enough to find it. She was waiting for you. The thought was a pang of bittersweet sorrow. A mother she'd never known had been protecting her all along, another link in the long chain of fate that had brought them here. They sat in comfortable silence for a long time, watching the fire dance, listening to the world outside slowly wake up. The bond between them was a warm, steady river, a constant, silent conversation. She could feel his deep contentment, his unwavering love, a force as real and as powerful as the stone walls of the citadel around them. He could feel her peace, the wild thing in her soul, no longer a frightened, hunted creature, but a serene and powerful presence, secure in its territory. Finally, he shifted, lifting her chin with his free hand. The prophecy the Fen showed you, he said softly, a crown of bone and a king's pyre. You were right about it all. It wasn't your death, she whispered, her eyes searching his. It was the death of the king you were forced to be, the end of the lies. And the crown of bone. A true smile lit her face now, bright and confident. It was never a crown to be worn, it was the foundation of the new one, built from the bones of a broken tradition. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a love so profound it stole her breath. He saw her, not the Omega, not the curse, not the queen. He saw Raisa, the woman who had walked back into his hall smelling of pine and riverstone, the woman who had chosen to stay, the woman who was the other half of his soul. He stood, lifting her effortlessly into his arms, and carried her to the great arched window. The dawn was breaking, a line of pale, shimmering silver on the eastern horizon. The last of the stars were fading. The snow below was no longer a shroud of death and pursuit, but a clean white blanket, melting away to reveal the promise of green beneath. He set her down, wrapping his arms around her from behind, his chin resting on the crown of her head. They watched the sun climb, the silver light washing over the world, chasing the last of the shadows from the valleys. A new day, a new reign, a new life. He no longer had to listen for her footsteps in the hall, waiting in restless torment for her return. He could feel her with every beat of his own heart,